Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I wanted to talk to you guys about the timeline tools inside of DaVinci Resolve. So the timeline, of course, is over on the Edit tab of DaVinci Resolve, and this is going to be referring to everything over here from the selection mode to the zoom tools over here on the right. We'll also briefly mention a couple other things that you would see in the Edit interface. So when we're talking about the timeline tools, I'm referring to everything from the clip preview window and the timeline windows up here. So that's going to mean that the media pool and the effects library aren't so relevant to this video, so I'm going to push those aside for right now. And we're just going to focus on these tools. So as you can see, I already have a few clips in the timeline, made a couple basic cuts, which of course are indicated wherever you see this line going between two clips. So starting with the selection tool, this is most useful when you want to select clips, move them around, or maybe you're selecting a few to delete it instead. So I have this already cut up clip, and I can left click and drag it around on the timeline. Very simple. You can also use the selection tool in order to manage some of the edges around the time of a clip. So if you go to the edge of a clip, you'll notice that you're actually able to manipulate it with the selection tool as well. So what this little icon with the square bracket represents is that I can click and I can drag this clip in and out. If I choose, I can have it extend as long as there's video footage from the original source. And I can extend that over another clip, overriding whatever exists in the timeline. Likewise, we can do exactly the same thing by clicking on the right side clip. You'll know which clip you're working on because the direction of the square bracket will be reversed, so we can drag that around. And if we have extra footage, we can push it to the left, overriding the first clip, but only as long as we have footage available. If you run out of footage from the source material, you'll get this red line indication showing you that basically you've gotten to the end of that clip. Now, making these timeline adjustments with the selection tool is pretty easy, but you might run into the circumstance where you try to position one clip over another one, and it's hard to get it to be exact. So in this situation, you don't actually want to overwrite anything from one of the clips to the left or the right, but instead what you want it to do is snap. So the snapping tool is right over here. You can also hit N as a key binding. And with that turned on, if we try to drag these clips around, it's going to snap to the edge of whichever clip we move it close to. You'll also notice that it will snap to the timeline positioner there just as easily. So snapping is really good when you want to be precise with your clips. And for that reason, I'll generally leave that turned on. You can also left click, of course. So another good thing to point out would be that if you left click and drag a box around your clips, you can actually select all of them and move them and manipulate them at once. So I left click and I drag, and I can move all of the clips back to the start. So the next tool we're going to talk about is trim edit mode. This is really useful when you want to get some fine-grained editing on the edges of a clip. So you want to shave off or add maybe 1/10 of a second, then the trim edit mode becomes pretty useful. So I'm going to zoom into the timeline over here. And if we hover over the center of our clip, you'll get this little thing that looks like, you'll get this icon that looks kind of like a film strip. So if we left click, we can actually drag it to the right and the left as long as we have footage remaining from the original clip. And without changing the length of the edited clip in the timeline, we can change which source material is actually going to fit into this space. So we're not changing we're changing which clip gets shown, but we're not changing how long the duration is. So it's a lot more useful when you have, let's say, seconds or minutes of extra footage. So by using this tool, it becomes really easy to define exactly when a clip will start or end. You can also see on the left and the right here, the little white outlines, which will indicate how much footage you have before and after the clip that's currently not being shown. So it's a good indicator when you're getting close to the edge of a clip or when you're getting close to the beginning. If you left click on one of the edges with the trim edit mode, it's basically going to give you the same effect where you're still dragging the clip. You may also notice that you can left click between two clips and adjust the cutting point for those two clips, thus extending one clip and shortening the other one. And if we left click towards the bottom where we have the name of the clip rather than the footage, we can adjust the clip's position in our timeline. So this is basically dragging it to the right, and you'll notice that if there's footage available, it will automatically add that to the before and after clips so you don't get any black space. This allows us to position exactly where we want the clip without leaving any black space. So next we have a pretty useful tool that they added in DaVinci Resolve 15, which is the dynamic trim mode. So while dynamic trim mode is enabled, we'll get this little yellow timeline indicator instead of the traditional red one. And when we hit play, it's going to go from about 1 second beforehand to 1 second afterwards of this timeline indicator, play that, and then return to this point where we have it currently set, rather than the timeline indicator moving and permanently staying wherever we stop it. So the advantage here is that by returning to this point, we're able to keep playing this clip as we make tiny little edits and see those changes a little bit faster. So if I decide here that I want to hit play, see the clip playing, and then I decide to trim it in real time, it's going to return this timeline indicator here, and it will be really easy to keep playing this clip back and seeing how all of the little changes affect our overall presentation. So I'm going to drag this over here and remove some of the original footage. So I'm going to trim this like 1/5 of a second by moving it to the right, which means the first 1/5 of a second is cut off now. And now I'm going to play it back one more time. I'm deciding I want to trim it some more. It returns, so I want to play it back one more time by hitting space. It becomes really easy to reiterate on your trims. Now there's also another thing you can do with dynamic trim mode using the keys J, K, and L on your keyboard. Without dynamic trim mode, J, K, and L are usually there for playing back either in reverse or in forward your clip at either ×1 speed or faster than that. But in dynamic trim mode, what we're actually doing with it is trimming the clip. So if I hit J, it's going to trim the clip by adding footage to the start until I hit stop, or K. The K key is used to stop between J, K, and L. And if I hit L, it's going to trim the clip in the opposite direction. It's going to remove footage until I decide to stop it. So I can hit K for a quick stop. We can also go over here to the end clip and do the same thing. But now note that when you're using these tools, it will trim whichever clip you have selected. So if I select over here, even if the timeline cursor is over to the left, I can still hit J, K, and L, and it's going to be trimming the border of the clips that I have actually selected. But yeah, just to compare, if you didn't know, normally using J is going to go in reverse, so you can hit J multiple times to go in reverse very fast, and you can hit L to go forward with the timeline very fast. So while JKL is normally just a quick way to move in the timeline, but when you have dynamic trim mode enabled, it's for trimming the space at the end or start of a clip. Now there's one thing I haven't mentioned yet, which is if you right click on dynamic trim mode, there's actually 2 modes here, slip and slide. So that refers to what will happen when you hit the E key. So I have dynamic trim mode enabled and we have slip. So when you're in slip mode and you go over a point in your timeline, like over here, so what's going to happen is just like with normal trim mode, if you were to left click on a clip and drag it around, it's going to be doing essentially the same thing. But instead of you having to manually drag it, it will do it to the extent that your timeline cursor in dynamic trim mode is set apart from the start or end of a clip. So if I have this clip selected and I hit E, it's going to immediately adjust the clip by sliding along the clip that is actually used for this part in the timeline. Kind of like an instant trim edit mode. But if I switch the dynamic trim mode over to slide, so for the amount of time that exists between the start of this currently selected clip and the timeline cursor, it's going to push that area over to the left when I hit E. So I hit E here, and then that initial area is now being pushed over here to the left. So rather than trimming the clip, it's moving the clip. One of the most useful tools in the timeline is the blade edit mode. So this is when you want to actually split a clip into multiple clips. So if I have blade edit mode selected, which I can do by hitting B, and I left click anywhere on one of our clips, it will immediately slice that clip into 2 clips. And this is really useful because now we can do something like drag this new clip, which is created out of the original clip, over here and have them be 2 separate clips. I can also right click them and do a ripple delete to get rid of the unwanted footage, and thus trimming our timeline into more of the final video that we're actually looking for. If I go back to selection mode and I left click it, I can hit Ctrl X to cut it out of the timeline, which leaves the space as opposed to ripple delete. If we want the ripple delete shortcuts, it would be more like a shift backspace. But yes, frequently the idea with blade edit mode is that there will be times in your original video footage where it's not what you actually want to use in the final product. And that's where you can make these really huge slices, shaving off minutes from your recorded footage and get it a lot closer to where you need it to be. And then you can make the final touches on your basic edits with trim edit mode and the new dynamic trim mode. So when you do cut a clip, it doesn't actually go away completely. So if I slice this again and I select this clip and I hit Control X to cut it, just like in another program like Microsoft Paint or Microsoft Word, it still exists in the memory buffer. So that means I can paste it in. If I go over anywhere on the timeline and I position my cursor properly, I can also hit Control V to paste it in multiple times if I want. And that can be really useful because sometimes you're not trying to remove a clip altogether, but you just want part of the clip to be in a different area. So you might be wondering, what about this black space we have between the clips? Surely we don't want that in the final video, right? So you can actually get rid of the black space very easily by left clicking on it, right clicking and doing a ripple delete, which will take all of the black space between two clips and just remove it, pushing those two clips together. So over here I can do that once again, right click, ripple delete, very easy. So let's talk about these next three options for adding a clip to the timeline. Now this might be a clip that you pull in from your media pool. So for instance, if I double click on the Statue of Liberty clip again and I hit I to set an endpoint and O to set an out point, I can now add that in to our timeline. It also works with clips that you've cut like we did before that exist in the memory buffer. You can add those back in with these three tools as well. So we have insert clip, overwrite clip, and replace clip. So what insert clip is going to do is it's going to take the exact space where you have your timeline indicator set, and it's going to add the clip right in there. So if there's any clips that exist to the right, they're still going to exist, but they're going to be pushed to the right to make space for the incoming clip. And yes, if we're adding our new clip right between two clips, like what happened right now, it will make the necessary cut. So I insert clip, and we have our new clip added in here. The older clips that exist to the right are pushed to the right to make space for it, and the cuts are made. So that's one option for adding your clip into a timeline. So overwrite clip is similar, except that instead of the clips that exist to the right in the timeline being pushed to the right, any clip that gets in the way of the incoming clip are just going to be overwritten. Now that can be partial, it doesn't have to be the entire clip. So if I overwrite here, the other instance of the Statue of Liberty clip still exists, but for the time that the new clip was added, it's been overwritten. So you do want to be careful about doing that to make sure you don't lose any data that you actually want to keep in your final video. Now, another option is replace clip. You can also notice the have F9, F10, F11 hotkeys. But replace clip is going to take the clip we have selected. So I'll go over here for the Sydney night time lapse. And regardless of the duration of the incoming clip, it's going to take the old clip and replace it with the new clip. So if I hit replace clip here, the Statue of Liberty clip just simply replaces that old clip. If I were to make this Sydney clip a lot longer and I replace it, then what you'll notice is that it can only replace to the duration of the incoming clip. So if the incoming clip is actually shorter than the old clip, part of the old clip will still remain. However, if the old clip is actually shorter than the new clip and we hit replace, then what you'll notice is that the incoming clip will only be added to the maximum duration of the old clips. So it won't extend the timeline in any way, but it may leave a remainder if the old clip is longer. So next we have linked selection, which I believe is enabled by default. So what you'll notice on the timeline is that any video clip we bring in also has an audio clip associated with it. And you might notice that they have these little linked symbols down here indicating that they are linked to something. And as long as we have linked selection mode enabled, if we click on one of these clips, it's actually going to be selecting both the video track and the audio track. Now, in a lot of cases, that's really useful, like when we want to move the audio with the video, so like left clicking and dragging that over, it becomes very convenient. But there are times where we might actually want to turn off linked selection. So if we turn that off, and I left click to undo my selection, and then I left click on the audio track, I can edit the audio track individually. So I could drag that out here and desync the audio, usually not something you want. Or I could possibly use the blade edit mode and make a cut, but only for the audio of that clip instead. So I can make that cut and hit Control X to cut it away. And then I've removed only the audio. The video would still exist for that particular clip. So sometimes it's useful to not select them both at the same time. So next we have position lock. Once you've edited all your clips together and maybe you're trying to apply special effects or titles, you may not actually want to move the positions of anything on your timeline anymore. So if you hit position lock, it actually locks all of your video and audio tracks simultaneously. And what this means is no matter how much I left click and move stuff around, I can't actually move the positions of the clips. So when you're done setting the positions and basic cuts of all your clips, position lock may be useful so that you don't make accidental changes. Note though that you don't have to use position lock there. You can actually lock individual tracks. So if I wanted to lock the video track, I just click on the lock for the video track over here in the timeline. Okay, so next up are flags and markers. So flags and markers are primarily there just to indicate little notes to either you or anybody else who may be working on the video project. So flags apply to an entire clip and instances of that clip. So if I was to go over here, I'll enable linked selection mode. But if I go over here and I left click to add a flag, or you can click on the drop down to set a color, it's going to add a flag to any instance of that clip. So what does the red flag mean? Well, that entirely depends on you. It's mostly just a visual indicator, but we can double click on the flag and we can add a note if we choose. So we could say something like this clip needs editing and hit done. And you'll notice that there's a little circle there now, which indicates that there's a note associated with it. So anyone else looking at the project can get an idea of what maybe needs to be done by setting little notes like that. Markers are very similar, except instead of marking an entire clip, it marks a position in the clip. So if I go over here and we decide maybe this is where we want to add a special effect, but we haven't done it yet, then we can add a marker here. And you'll notice that it will say marker 1 and the timestamp for that marker. And we could double click it if we want to add a note and say transition here. And maybe we add a keyword and say SFX. And then that little marker can indicate something in the timeline. So maybe you're just referencing that for yourself, like, oh, this is when I actually have some animation set up in the inspector, or maybe it could be a marker for something that needs to be done. But besides just being a note, you can actually snap to those markers. So if I drag this around, you'll notice that with snapping enabled, that it will automatically snap to that marker. And when I do that, you'll notice that the note is also added up there in the timeline viewer. And we could always go in and add another marker, even if it's the same color. And maybe we can say like transition done. And then later on when we create the transitions, then we know when we want the starting and end points to be without having to figure it out later because we've already set up those markers. Now, what you should know is that the markers do move with the clip itself. So if I move this clip over here, the markers are tied to the clip. So keep that in mind. As long as you don't move the markers, they'll always be at the same position in the clip. But if you delete the clip or move the clip, then those markers are going to move or be deleted with them. Okay, so really quickly here, the zoom tools, pretty obvious. If you want to zoom out on the timeline, you move this over to the left, and when you're working in like a multi-hour project, that'll allow you to see the full scope of everything all at once. But if you need to get much closer, more zoomed in, so you can actually work effectively and make edits, then you can move this over to the right side, the zoom in side. And also we can control the audio volume of the DaVinci Resolve playback over here on the right hand side. So if we want it to be more quiet, we can drag the audio to the left. If we want to mute it altogether, you simply click on the little speaker sound. And then finally, timeline view options over here next to the zoom. If we click on that, you'll notice that there are a few basic options we can set up for our timeline. So the options in here, by default, stacked timeline is not enabled. If we enable it here, then what will happen is that we can have multiple timelines and we can view them all at the same time. In order to create a new timeline, we can go to File and then New Timeline, and maybe we just call it Timeline 2. We create that, we drag some media clips in. So by having multiple timelines, you can do things like separate major parts of your video. Maybe you want to create the intro for your clips separately from the main body content of your video, or maybe you want to work at two projects at once within the same DaVinci Resolve instance. You could do either of those here, and stacked timelines make it pretty easy to do that, but you don't necessarily need that. You can also just come up here to the timeline viewer and change the timeline, which will reflect down here in the timeline itself. So if you have subtitles added to your video, they'll show up, I believe, in the video area for the timeline, and you'll be able to kind of see the subtitles, and you'll be able to see the subtitles written here as you're working in the editing, but you can have the option of turning that off if you feel that's too much information. There's also audio waveforms. So audio waveforms are very useful. When you import a video clip that actually has audio, unlike these little stock clips, and you have audio waveforms enabled, you'll be able to see the audio levels at any point for the clip. So you'll be able to see when someone is speaking, you'll get the audio raising up loud, or if there's music, you'll see some consistent patterns in the background. You could also use it to kind of pick up on basically any kind of noise. So if a clip had too much background noise, it becomes easier to identify that with audio waveforms as well. So you can enable either 0 of those or all 3, up to you. And then you come down here and you see clip view options. So with the first option here, it will create tiny little thumbnails for every position in your clip for which it can actually show something on screen. If you're zoomed out, it's going to show a lot less of these little timeline position thumbnails. But if you're zoomed in, you'll get quite a lot of them. And the point of these is so that you can know roughly where you're clicking on a clip before you actually do it. So it's kind of a little preview for you. On weaker machines, though, it can create a problem because generating all these thumbnails can be a little bit taxing on weaker machines. So if you decide you don't like these little thumbnails or you want to reduce them, you can go to the second option, which is to only have a thumbnail at the start and end of a clip. So you can see these little thumbnails here, a lot lighter on machines, but you can still roughly tell which clip you're looking at just by seeing the starting thumbnail or the ending thumbnail. And then the third option here is no thumbnails at all, and it actually collapses the tracks down. So this would be useful if you have a lot of tracks going on and you want to be able to look at them all at once. The only problem is that with no thumbnail indication, if you do have a lot of tracks, it may become a little hard to remember which thing was which. So for right now, I will return that to the single thumbnail at the start and the end. So lastly, we have track height, which is for video and audio. Now you can adjust the height of individual video and audio tracks by left-clicking on the border between video tracks. If you left-click on the border between video and audio, it's actually going to be dragging the whole timeline up or down. But if you click up here at the top of video 1 and you drag that up, it'll increase the size of the track. And if we go down here and click between A1 and A2, audio 1 and audio 2, and drag that down, we can make that track bigger, which is really useful for audio, for instance, because you'll be able to see the waveforms more clearly if you have that enabled up here. But if you want to adjust all the tracks simultaneously, then you can just do video track height and scale that up, and then audio track height. And then if you have 3, 4, 5 tracks, it'll adjust them all simultaneously. So a bit of a time saver. So pretty much that just about covers all of the basic timeline tools inside of DaVinci Resolve editing. Of course, there's a lot more things you can do in the edit tab for DaVinci Resolve, but we will get into that in future videos. So I've been Chris, thanks for watching. I hope you guys learned a lot, and I will see you in my future DaVinci Resolve content.